The air inside the grocery store was heavy, a blend of stale warmth and the faint chill that drifted in whenever the automatic doors slid open. It was a cold winter evening, and most customers moved quickly, eager to return to the comfort of their homes. Among them was a small figure, easily overlooked, a young girl, her oversized coat patched and worn, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in one hand and a few coins in the other. Her name was Emma. She walked the aisles slowly, her eyes darting between the shelves and the list in her hand. Each item seemed like a distant dream, far out of reach of her meager savings. But still, she searched, determined to find enough to feed her mother waiting at home. Behind the counter, Josh, the grocery clerk, leaned lazily against the register. His sharp eyes followed Emma as a smirk played across his face. To him, she was just another poor kid, a reminder of everything he thought he'd never be. He whispered something to his coworker, and they both chuckled, their laughter carrying just loud enough for Emma to hear. She flinched but kept her focus, her hands trembling as she picked up a loaf of bread. "Do you think she can even pay for that?" Josh muttered under his breath, his voice laced with mockery. Emma hesitated, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as she glanced toward the counter. She placed the bread back on the shelf, her heart sinking as the weight of reality settled in. She couldn't afford it. Josh's laughter grew louder, and a few customers turned to look, their faces filled with discomfort but not enough courage to intervene. In that moment, Emma felt smaller than ever, her hopes slowly crumbling. Little did anyone know, the quiet sound of a shopping cart rolling into the store would change everything. Emma's world had always been one of quiet resilience. Raised in a small, worn-down house with peeling wallpaper and dimly lit rooms, she learned early that happiness wasn't found in things. It was found in the small moments. Her mother's comforting touch, the warmth of the fire crackling in the living room, and the hope that every new day might bring something better. But the weight of her circumstances had slowly dimmed those once bright moments. Her mother's illness had turned everything upside down. Once a vibrant woman full of laughter and love, she now lay motionless for most of the day, unable to care for herself. Emma had become the caretaker, the provider, her role far beyond what any child should bear. Each day felt like an uphill battle, with Emma's mind constantly racing between her schoolwork and finding the next meal to bring home. Every penny counted, and every decision about what to buy in the store was laden with guilt. Could they survive another week? Could she keep her mother's spirits up, even as her own hope seemed to fade? Josh, on the other hand, had never known the kind of struggle Emma faced. He worked at the grocery store, a job he'd taken to get away from the suffocating expectations of his family. Raised in a home where success was the only thing that mattered, Josh learned early that the world didn't care about your struggles. It cared about what you could offer. His parents often told him he needed to do better, to stand out, to make something of himself, but the pressure felt endless. In his mind, wealth and status were the answers to everything. They were the walls he built around himself to protect against the feeling that he wasn't enough. His bitterness ran deep, fed by years of being told he was not good enough. Josh's fear was simple, yet consuming: to be invisible, to be forgotten. He sought validation in every corner, mocking those who didn't have what he thought was necessary to survive, to thrive. To him, Emma wasn't just a poor girl. She was a reflection of everything he despised about weakness and failure. He couldn't fathom her struggles, yet he saw in her something he wished he could escape from, a mirror that reflected his own deepest insecurities. As Emma walked through the store, carefully selecting what she could afford, she didn't know how close she was to crossing paths with someone who would change her life forever. The weight of her choices, the burden of providing for her mother, seemed impossible to bear. And yet, the hope in her heart never fully extinguished. She held on to it tightly, as though it might be the one thing that could keep her family from falling apart. Josh, unaware of the weight Emma carried, watched her with a sense of superiority. But there was something in the way she moved, something that nagged at him, that made him question his own beliefs. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his own frustration with life. Yet, he couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this girl he didn't know, as if the universe had aligned their paths for a reason. In this moment, neither Emma nor Josh knew that the world was about to change for them. Neither of them could see that the smallest act of kindness could shift their entire reality, bringing them face to face with something bigger than either of them understood. The evening seemed to drag on, each passing minute stretching into an eternity. The grocery store, once buzzing with activity, had begun to quiet as the hours crept later. Emma stood by the frozen food section, her fingers brushing over the cold glass as she stared at the prices. She had just enough for a few essentials, but not nearly enough to make her mother's dinner any better. Her stomach twisted in knots, the weight of her situation pulling her deeper into despair. Josh, meanwhile, leaned against the counter, growing more restless by the minute. His shift was almost over, but something about the girl, Emma, had begun to gnaw at him. The way she moved, so determined despite her obvious struggle, it bothered him. There was something raw about her, something that cracked the surface of his carefully built armor. He tried to shake the feeling off, focusing instead on the last few customers making their way through the aisles. But every time his eyes drifted toward her, he couldn't look away. Emma, unaware of the growing attention, picked up the last item on her list, a can of soup, and made her way to the checkout. Her heart pounded with each step, and she wondered if she had enough change. She could already feel the judgment in the air, the whispers of the people around her. They didn't see her as a person, only as a problem. She reached the register, her hands trembling as she unloaded her items onto the conveyor belt. Josh greeted her with a forced smile, the same one he had for all customers, but this time it was different. The tension in the air was palpable. "Is this all, miss?" Josh asked, his voice cold. Yet there was something behind it, something Emma couldn't quite place. She nodded, trying to steady her hands as she reached for her coins. Josh watched her with a mixture of pity and disdain. "It's going to be a little short," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Can't get much for what you've got, huh?" Emma froze, her face burning with shame. She had been ready for this moment, but hearing it from Josh, someone she barely knew, stung more than she expected. She glanced down at her small pile of change, feeling the weight of her helplessness. A few moments passed before Emma spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll put it back," she said quietly, her eyes trained on the floor. She was about to turn away when something unexpected happened. A man, tall and imposing, stepped up to the counter behind her. His presence filled the space with an undeniable energy that shifted the mood in an instant. He was dressed in a simple, dark jacket and jeans, but there was something about him that made the entire store take notice. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but filled with an authority that couldn't be ignored. Josh looked up, startled by the interruption. Emma didn't even look at him. "I don't have enough," she said, still focused on her change. I'll just put it back." The man glanced at Emma, then at Josh, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She's short on money. Are you going to help her, or are you just going to let her walk away with nothing?" Josh's throat tightened. He recognized the man instantly. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, the one who had been all over the news. The very man he had mocked in private conversations with his friends, certain that someone like him would never have any interest in the likes of Emma. Yet, here he was, standing at the counter with a look in his eyes that Josh couldn't read. Elon's eyes flicked between Josh and Emma, the tension hanging thick in the air. There was a long moment of silence before he spoke again. "I'll pay for her groceries." Josh blinked, not believing what he was hearing. "Excuse me," he stammered, his voice betraying him. "I said, I'll pay for her groceries," Elon repeated, this time with more force. His gaze never left Josh. "Is there a problem?" Josh's mind raced, his instinct screaming at him to do something, anything, to salvage the situation. But it was too late. The eyes of the customers had already turned toward them, and the murmurs had begun. Before he could respond, Elon had already pulled out his wallet and handed Josh more than enough to cover the cost of Emma's items. "Put it on my tab," Elon said, nodding toward the clerk, "and give her whatever she needs." Emma's eyes flickered between Elon and the counter, disbelief settling over her. She hadn't expected this, couldn't have possibly imagined it. Was this a joke? Some kind of cruel prank? But as she looked at the genuine kindness in Elon's eyes, the wall she had built around herself began to crack. But the moment wasn't without consequences. Josh's face turned red, his mind racing to keep up with the unfolding events. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be in control. He was the one who had power here, who had the right to mock, to belittle. Now, everything was spinning out of his grasp. And then, just as the tension seemed to peak, Elon turned to Emma, his voice soft but filled with conviction. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. Not here. Not anywhere. Emma, still processing the whirlwind of emotions crashing over her, nodded slowly. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Not for her poverty, not for her struggle, but for who she truly was. Josh, on the other hand, was left standing in the quiet aftermath, the weight of his actions crashing over him. What had just happened? Why had he been so quick to judge? And why did it feel as though everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was suddenly slipping through his fingers? The store seemed to hold its breath, the moment lingering in the air as the small, seemingly insignificant act of kindness reverberated through the room. Emma's life, and Josh's, were about to change in ways neither could have foreseen. But for now, they were caught in the quiet tension of the present, unsure of what was to come, but knowing, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The moment of calm after Elon Musk's act of generosity was short-lived. Emma stood frozen in place, her bag clutched tightly in her hands, her mind racing. The crowd had scattered, some still murmuring in disbelief, but most were busy with their own lives. For Emma, it was as though the world had paused. The weight of everything she had been carrying suddenly lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Elon, her voice barely audible. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure if the words could even begin to express her gratitude. Elon nodded, his face unreadable, as if the exchange had meant little to him. But then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was turning to leave, disappearing into the aisles of the store. Emma watched him go, still in shock. She barely noticed Josh standing a few feet away, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his apron. He had been silent throughout the exchange, but now that Elon was gone, his voice broke the stillness. "You think you've won?" Josh's words were sharp, edged with bitterness. He took a step toward Emma, his eyes narrowing. "You think he did this out of kindness?" Emma blinked, caught off guard. She had expected gratitude, maybe even a quiet sense of relief. But Josh's words hit her like a slap. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice quiet but defensive. Josh's eyes burned with a mix of anger and resentment. "You think he's a hero, don't you?" he spat. "You think he just handed you money because he cares about people like you? Think again." The accusation hung in the air, and Emma took a cautious step back. What was he saying? "He's not the saint you think he is," Josh continued, his voice lower now, as though he were speaking a dark secret. "He's just doing this for himself. He doesn't care about you. He's just buying your gratitude, buying your silence." Emma recoiled, her mind struggling to process his words. What was happening? Was she supposed to be angry? Should she be feeling betrayed by someone who had been nothing but kind to her? Josh's words kept coming, relentless and venomous. "Do you think he's any different from me? He's rich, he's powerful, and he doesn't care about people like you. He's using you just like everyone else." Emma's pulse quickened. This wasn't the man who had just helped her. This was a man full of resentment and bitterness, someone who had built walls around himself to shield against a world he thought was cruel. But as much as she wanted to reject Josh's words, there was a small part of her, buried deep inside, that wondered if he was right. As Josh's voice trailed off, Emma's breath hitched. She tried to steady herself, but everything she had believed in, everything she had hoped for, seemed to be unraveling. Elon had been kind to her, but could Josh's accusations be true? Was there something more to Elon's gesture? The store's lights flickered, and the weight of the moment seemed to press in on her. The confrontation, so sudden and charged with raw emotion, was more than just a clash of personalities. It felt like a collision of ideals. Josh had revealed something that shook Emma to her core, and she had no idea how to respond. In the silence that followed, Emma stood there, uncertain of where her feelings should land. She wanted to believe in the kindness she had witnessed, to hold on to the hope that there were still people in the world who cared. But Josh's words kept echoing in her head, planting seeds of doubt. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands shaking slightly as she read the message. It was from her mother. "I need you here now. Something's wrong." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. The reality of her life, the constant struggles, the fear of losing everything, came rushing back. The moment with Elon, the unexpected kindness, now felt distant. She wasn't sure she could trust anything anymore. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Josh's gaze followed her, his expression unreadable. But before she could reach the door, she caught a glimpse of Elon, standing near the entrance, watching her from a distance. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, Emma's full of confusion, Elon's unreadable. And in that brief exchange, everything seemed to shift once more. Was Elon truly trying to help? Or was there more to this story than she could understand? Was she just another pawn in a game she couldn't see? As Emma stepped out into the cold night, the city felt darker, more uncertain than before. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, her heart heavy with the weight of the unanswered questions. What had started as an unexpected act of kindness had now become a turning point, a moment that would change everything. And the storm was far from over. The turning point had arrived, and now there was no going back. The night had fallen, but the storm inside Emma had only just begun. As she walked through the city streets, the cold wind biting at her skin, her mind raced. The message from her mother echoed in her thoughts, a call to action that made her heart pound with anxiety. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like she was standing at the precipice of something life-changing. She arrived at her mother's small apartment, a dingy building that reeked of years of neglect. Her hand trembled as she knocked, the door creaking open to reveal her mother, pale and trembling. The old woman's eyes were wide with fear, her hands shaking as she grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her inside. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mother was always strong, but tonight, something was different. The air was thick with unease. "They're coming for us, Emma," her mother whispered, the words almost too quiet to hear. "The bank, they're taking everything. The house, the money. We have nothing left." Emma's stomach dropped. This wasn't just some minor setback. It was everything. They had fought for so long, scraping by, surviving against all odds. But this was the end. Her mother's words felt like a death sentence. Before Emma could respond, there was a knock at the door. A loud, insistent knock. Emma froze, her heart racing in her chest. Her mother's eyes widened in panic. "They're here," she breathed, backing away from the door. "I told you they'd come." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had heard rumors about the ruthless debt collectors, but to face them now, at her mother's weakest moment, felt unbearable. The door swung open without warning, revealing two men in dark suits, their expressions cold and uncaring. They stepped into the apartment without hesitation. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, fixed his gaze on Emma. "We're here to take what's owed," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The bank is taking the property. You have no choice." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Every fiber of her being screamed to fight, but she was powerless. Her mother's dreams, everything they had worked for, were slipping away. Just then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside, growing louder. Emma's pulse quickened as she turned, half expecting another wave of debt collectors. But then, to her shock, the figure that appeared in the doorway wasn't a stranger. It was Elon Musk. His presence was like a sudden gust of wind, a force that cut through the tension in the room. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene with an intensity that made the men pause. He was dressed casually, but there was no mistaking the authority that radiated from him. "I believe you're in the wrong place," Elon said coolly, his gaze narrowing at the two men who stood frozen. "This woman and her daughter are not for you to take. You'll leave now." The men hesitated, clearly unsure how to react to the unexpected intervention. One of them stepped forward, trying to assert dominance. "And who are you to tell us what to do? You don't own this place." Elon's expression remained unreadable. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a stone wall. "I don't need to own this place, but I can make sure you don't leave here with anything," he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. For a moment, there was silence, the room thick with tension. Emma's mind was reeling. She had been caught in the storm of her own desperation, but now it seemed as if a new storm was forming, one that could either save them or destroy everything they had left. The men exchanged a glance, clearly intimidated by Elon's unwavering stance. With a begrudging nod, they turned and walked toward the door, clearly unwilling to engage further. As they left, Elon stepped forward, his eyes locking with Emma's. She didn't know what to say. Her heart was still racing, the shock of what had just unfolded washing over her in waves. "Why?" she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you help us?" Elon's gaze softened, just for a moment. "Because I've seen people like you get crushed under the weight of a world that doesn't care. And I've had enough of watching it happen." He paused, then added, "But this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who doesn't have a voice." Emma's mind spun. For a brief moment, it was as though the world had slowed down. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. This was something bigger, something that touched the core of who she was, who they all were. Elon wasn't just a billionaire trying to play hero. He was someone who had seen the cracks in the world and was trying to fix them, one piece at a time. As Elon turned to leave, Emma stood there, torn between disbelief and a profound sense of gratitude. But before he could walk out the door, something inside Emma shifted. The question that had been plaguing her mind since she met him, since he had paid for everyone's groceries, rose to the surface once more. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice shaking. But this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of desperation. "Why did you help us?" Elon turned, his eyes catching hers, and for the first time, his guarded expression softened. "Because sometimes people need to see a way out. And if I can be that way, even for a moment, then maybe the world can be a little less broken." The weight of his words hit Emma like a tidal wave, and in that instant, everything shifted. She understood what he was trying to say. This wasn't just about money or kindness. It was about the human connection, the understanding that in a world full of chaos, sometimes the smallest acts of empathy could create a ripple that changed everything. As Elon walked out of the apartment, leaving her with a mixture of awe and wonder, Emma stood there, her heart pounding. She had no idea what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure: the moment had arrived. The storm had broken, and there was no going back. The dust had settled. The storm of emotions, fears, and uncertainty had subsided, but the silence that followed was heavier than anything Emma had ever felt before. Standing in the doorway of her mother's apartment, she took in the sight of the two empty chairs where the debt collectors had been moments ago. It was hard to comprehend what had just happened. Her entire life had shifted in an instant. Elon Musk, the man who had walked into their lives like a thunderstorm and left just as suddenly, had changed everything. But the real question lingered in Emma's mind. Why? Her mother, still sitting in her chair, her face pale and tired, looked at Emma with eyes filled with both relief and confusion. "Emma, do you think this is really the end?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the question that had been haunting both of them for years. Could this be the end of their struggles, the end of feeling powerless against the world that kept pushing them down? Emma didn't answer immediately. She was too lost in her own thoughts, replaying the events of the past few hours in her mind. The way the debt collectors had hesitated in the face of Elon's presence, how his simple act of stepping in had shifted the balance of power so dramatically. For the first time in her life, she had witnessed a kind of force that was capable of altering the course of history. Her history, their history. But despite everything that had happened, there was an undeniable sense of disbelief that lingered in Emma's heart. Could one act of kindness really undo years of hardship? Could a single person, even someone like Elon Musk, truly make a difference in a world that seemed designed to crush people like her? "Maybe this is just a temporary fix," Emma finally said, her voice steady but reflective. "Maybe we won't always be able to rely on someone like him to save us. Maybe we have to start saving ourselves." Her mother nodded, the corners of her lips curling into a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "I think you're right, Emma, but sometimes we need someone to show us that we're worth saving." As the night stretched on, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Her mother had been right. Perhaps this wasn't the final resolution, but it had given them a new sense of hope, a spark of something they hadn't felt in years, a reminder that kindness could still exist in the darkest corners of their world. Emma stepped outside onto the small balcony, the cool night air brushing against her face as she gazed out at the city. The world, she realized, wasn't as unforgiving as it had once seemed. There were still moments of grace, moments of human connection that could make all the difference. She looked down at her phone, instinctively searching for Elon Musk's social media page. A part of her wanted to understand him more, to know why he had done what he had. But another part of her knew that sometimes the answers didn't matter. What mattered was the change he had brought, the example he had set. And that was something that no amount of questions could take away. As Emma stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized that life wasn't about waiting for someone to step in and save you. It was about realizing that you had the power to change your own narrative, to rise above the odds, and to fight for what you deserved. The resolution had come, but it wasn't in the form of a perfect ending. It was in the recognition that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there was always the potential for something beautiful to emerge, something unexpected, something transformative. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, Emma finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a better future. One step at a time, one decision at a time, she could create a life that was worth living. And perhaps, just perhaps, the story of a young girl, a mother, and an unlikely savior would be the catalyst for that change. With a final glance toward the horizon, Emma turned back inside, ready to face whatever came next. As the story unfolds, we're left with a powerful question. What is the true price of kindness, and what does it really mean to be saved? Elon Musk's gesture, an act that seemed so simple, yet so profound, changes everything for Emma and her mother. But as the dust settles and the weight of the moment begins to sink in, the real question arises. Was this the end of their struggles, or merely a brief glimpse of hope in an otherwise harsh world? The story reminds us that sometimes we don't need grand gestures to change the course of our lives. Sometimes it's the smallest acts, the unexpected kindnesses, the moments when someone simply chooses to show up, that can alter everything. But with that change comes another challenge. What do we do with the opportunities we're given? As Emma's journey teaches us, we cannot wait for others to save us. At some point, we must save ourselves. The kindness of others may open doors, but it's up to us to walk through them. So, I ask you, the audience, if you were in Emma's shoes, would you have been able to accept help from someone so unexpectedly? Would you have seen the value in someone offering you hope, even when you didn't know how to ask for it? In the end, the most important takeaway is this. The price of loyalty is often more than we expect, but so is the price of kindness. What are you willing to sacrifice for someone you care about, or even for someone you don't know? Reflect on this story and the decisions made by its characters. What kind of person would you be, faced with the same choices? The story leaves us with a challenge. Can we find the courage to change our own story, even when it seems impossible? Or will we wait, hoping for someone to step in and save us, just as Elon did for Emma? Take a moment and think about your own life. The twists, the turns, the moments of kindness and betrayal. What are you learning from them? And how will you use that knowledge to move forward? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional tales and thought-provoking content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Emma's shoes? Let's keep the conversation going.